Okay, so for my inquiry project, I chose to pick two places with fairly strong colonial histories and colonial backgrounds, and just kind of wanted to do a bit of a comparative look at and see how each country is handling their decolonial education and trying to implement more Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of learning to improve Indigenous graduation rates and Indigenous attendance as a whole, as I know both are pretty lacking in Australia and Canada. So we'll see what we find as we move forward here. Okay, so the first place I wanted to start was just looking at the similarities and differences of the colonial histories and the colonial education histories, to be exact, in terms of taking children from their homes and placing them in different institutions, or in Canada's situation, residential schools. So both countries experienced a forcible removal of children from families in an attempt to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the white society. So both countries had this idea that if Indigenous children and families weren't able to assimilate into the white society, that they wouldn't be able to make it, and they wouldn't be able to be successful in society. So children removed from households, placed in either institutions or residential schools, very similar, and also kind of an addition just of slave type job placements for Australian children that were taken from their home. So not always placed in an institutional or an educational setting. And looking forward, both taught to reject Indigenous culture and language. So just the whole idea of assimilating into the dominant society and then stripping away everything that attributes to your traditional culture, language practices, and turning into just the experience of devastating impacts such as high rates of depression, PTSD, poor health, and socioeconomic outcomes that are felt very heavily in both countries in the Indigenous community. So tiny little differences in residential schools and the institutional and slave type job placements, but overall lots of similarities looking at each country, and has attributed to kind of the same educational disparities moving forward, as we'll see. Okay, so for school goals and initiatives, I'm just looking at each country here and trying to get a baseline of what their major goals are and their major kind of programs, major initiatives they're putting forward to kind of teach for Indigenous education and teach for Indigenous ways of knowing, and try to bridge those educational gaps as we saw before. So Australia, off the bat, places kind of more of a heavy emphasis on learning and understanding the histories and how it attributes to the socioeconomic disparities. So their focus is more on making sure they accurately teach and accurately represent the histories of colonization in the region, how kind of those ways of knowing were displaced, and how it has turned into the socioeconomic situation we're in now. So beginning incorporating of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, they're just kind of on the track of putting Indigenous ways of knowing and embedding that into kind of every aspect of curriculum. So in Australia right now, it's still based more on kind of complete units rather than incorporating those ways of knowing into every aspect of teaching and learning. So when I say that, I just mean that they would kind of have set units and set lessons that seek to make sure they're giving accurate histories and kind of representations and ways of knowing of the Indigenous community as a whole, as opposed to kind of making sure they're including a holistic view of learning and Indigenous way of knowing into every kind of aspect of education, which the focus is kind of more on that for Canada. It's in terms of placing Indigenous ways of knowing, elder-centered learning, place-based learning into much more aspects of learning to create a more equitable and culturally inclusive classroom for all moving forward. So just looking at Australia again, majority don't have specified content to teach. It's up to the educator. There is a bit of a connect as we're looking at Canada here in terms of teaching those for Indigenous ways of knowing, and a culturally inclusive pedagogy is up to the educator and how they spin it and how they want to implement it into their teaching. So you can kind of see a connection there, although I think in Canada there's more of a educational base for moving forward. So under Canada, I have sufficient teaching and university courses. I think as educators moving up through education in the University of Saskatchewan, we have dealt a lot with Indigenous ways of knowing and implementing Indigenous ways of knowing, and kind of a more holistic nature of teaching in terms of kind of putting the learner first and creating a learner-centered teaching philosophy. An example of this I can kind of point out in my internship was just an inquiry project where kids were um, picking what they wanted to learn, picking how they wanted to learn it, and picking how they presented it. I think that kind of attributes to a more holistic view of learning in terms of putting the learner first and letting them kind of rely on their strengths and learn in ways that might be sufficient for them, and that they'd get more out of it. So another big aspect of in terms of Canada, of this Indigenous ways of knowing, is elder and place-based learning is of a major focus, which I think is super important. Anytime you can bring elders into the classroom, utilize place-based settings in your teaching, I think it creates a more holistic view of learning and teaching, and just that the connection to culture, direct connection, having an elder in the classroom or a place-based learning setting where students can really kind of feel and kind of divulge more in the culture and the histories in terms of where they've been and where they're going. And then in looking at Australia as a vice versa, one of their big programs and initiatives is the implementation of language specific curricula and programs. So they recognize that there has been a big disconnect in terms of languages, and the languages kind of dying out and falling away. So for Australia, it was big to implement a language specific curricula and teach for Indigenous languages moving forward to kind of bridge that connection between culture and language, because it's very evident that culture is embedded in language, and for them to kind of create the initiative to move forward and create the language specific curriculum and programs, I think it's going to help a lot moving forward. Yeah, and then just Canada, basing off the last part, just relationship and community building is a big focus. So when we're talking about reconciliation, the restoration of relationships, it's really important that we're doing it together. We're taking in community members, using them to teach wholeheartedly, teaching them for more culturally responsive pedagogy moving forward, and just doing it as a unified group, moving towards together reconciliation and incorporating those Indigenous ways of knowing. So, yes. Thank you.